September 2nd, 1945. 9:04 in the morning. General Yoshijiro Umezu leaned over a green cloth table on the deck of an American battleship and signed his name. He did not bow. He did not look up. He straightened, turned, and stood at rigid attention while the man who had destroyed his armies signed beneath him. MacArthur didn't flinch. He didn't demand anything. He had already won before a single pen touched paper. Here is the thing that nobody talks about. The Japanese officers who walked up the gangway of the USS Missouri that morning were not broken men. They were not trembling. They were not begging. General Umezu had stood before the Emperor of Japan 3 weeks earlier and argued loudly, furiously, that Japan should fight to the last civilian on the home islands rather than surrender. He had lost that argument. But he had not surrendered his identity. And when he stepped onto that deck, he intended to make one thing absolutely clear. You may have defeated us, but you have not broken us. This created a problem. A serious one. A problem that could have unraveled everything. Because if Umezu and the Japanese delegation managed to perform this moment on their own terms, if they could stand there with their ceremonial swords and their rigid composure and their samurai bearing and communicate even through body language alone that this was simply one military performing a transaction with another, then the ceremony meant nothing. Worse, it meant something dangerous. The German military had done exactly this after 1918. They had walked away from their defeat and spent 20 years convincing an entire generation that they had not truly lost, that they had been stabbed in the back, that the army had remained undefeated. That myth had produced Adolf Hitler. MacArthur was not going to let that happen. Not here. Not on his ship. Not on his morning. What he did instead is one of the most precise acts of psychological architecture in the history of military command. And it began not with a speech, not with a threat, not with a show of force. It began with a table. Rewind 6 weeks. Japan's surrender announcement came on August 15, 1945, broadcast over radio. In the Emperor's own voice, a voice that most Japanese citizens had never heard before in their lives. It was the first time Hirohito had ever spoken directly to his people. The nation went silent. Some wept. Some could not understand what they were hearing. And in military headquarters across the Pacific, the men who had been fighting this war for 4 years began to feel something they could barely name. It was over. But MacArthur knew with the cold certainty of a man who had studied Japan for decades that it was not truly over until it was made permanent, until it was witnessed, until it was built into the physical record of history in a way that could not be reinterpreted, softened, mythologized, or undone. The formal surrender ceremony had to accomplish something that artillery and atomic bombs could not. It had to reach into the belief system of 60 million people and reorganize it. It had to take an empire that had built its identity around the divine invincibility of its military and make the defeat real, not just administratively real, but visually, architecturally, historically real. MacArthur had approximately 18 days to design it. He began with the ship. The USS Missouri was chosen specifically because she was the most powerful American battleship afloat, named after the home state of President Harry Truman. She was anchored in Tokyo Bay Japanese waters, the harbor of the enemy capital, and her presence there communicated something without words. You could not choose a more complete symbol of what had happened in the Pacific if you tried. This was not neutral ground. This was conquered ground. He chose the location of the table with equal care. The surrender table was positioned in the center of the deck, covered with a green cloth. It was not a negotiating table. It was not positioned between two equal parties. The Japanese delegation would stand on one side. The Allied representatives would stand on the other. There was one way to read this arrangement, and MacArthur made sure there was no other. Then came the witnesses. This is where MacArthur's understanding of the situation became extraordinary. He did not simply invite senior Allied officers. He placed 2 specific men directly in his line of sight, positioned where the Japanese delegation would have to see them the moment they looked up from the documents. General Jonathan Wainwright, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. You need to understand who these men were. Wainwright had commanded American forces in the Philippines when Japan invaded in 1941. He had fought as long as he could. He had run out of food, medicine, ammunition, and men. In May 1942, in one of the most agonizing decisions in American military history, he surrendered Corregidor. He had spent the 3 years and 4 months since in Japanese prisoner of war camps. In those camps he had lost 60 pounds. He had been starved, humiliated, forced to perform manual labor under conditions that killed thousands of his men. He was 59 years old and looked older. Percival had commanded the British garrison at Singapore. In February 1942, he had surrendered to General Yamashita with 85,000 troops, the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. The Japanese military had celebrated it as proof of Western weakness. The photograph of Percival walking toward Japanese lines under a white flag had been printed on propaganda posters across Asia. MacArthur had specifically requested both men be present. He had arranged for them to stand directly behind him as the Japanese signed. When Umezu and Shigemitsu looked up from the surrender documents, they would see the living evidence of what this ceremony was reversing. They could not pretend otherwise. There was no visual escape. The message was built into the room. Now, the morning of September 2nd, the Japanese delegation arrived at 8:56 a.m. 11 men, 2 groups, military officers, first civilian diplomats behind them. The sky over Tokyo Bay was flat and gray. There was no dramatic sunlight, no cinematic clarity, just the low overcast of a Pacific morning and several hundred American officers and enlisted men lining every deck above in absolute silence. The silence was deliberate. MacArthur had not arranged cheering. He had not arranged jeering. He had arranged silence, the specific weighted silence of men who have already won and are waiting for the paperwork. That silence communicated something no shout could. We do not need to perform. We have nothing left to prove. You are here because we have already decided you would be here, and the only question that remains is how long it takes you to sign. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu came up the gangway with a cane. In 1932, a Korean independence activist had thrown a bomb at a Japanese military ceremony in Shanghai. Shigemitsu had lost his leg in the blast. He ascended the gangway slowly, visibly struggling. Every American officer on that deck watched him climb. Umezu followed. Dress uniform, rows of medals, ceremonial sword at his hip. His face was what Japanese military culture demanded in this moment, a mask. Absolute stillness. The body held with correctness so rigid it communicated a message of its own. He was not here as a man accepting defeat. He was here as a soldier fulfilling an imperial order. There was a difference. He intended that difference to be seen. MacArthur let them reach the table. He let them stand. He waited until the delegation was fully assembled, and then he arrived. He did not rush. He walked with his characteristic long stride. He came to the microphone. He looked at the delegation and then out at the assembled officers. And then he spoke, and his voice was flat and deliberate, in the way of a man who has already decided how this ends. He said the parties would now execute the formal surrender. Shigemitsu sat down at the table. He adjusted his cane. He looked at the documents, and then he appeared to examine them. For what witnesses later described as an agonizing length of time, he sat there pen in hand, reading, or appearing to read. The hesitation was visible to everyone on the deck. MacArthur said nothing. He watched. 30 seconds, 45. A minute passed. Then, in a voice that multiple accounts describe as sharply quiet, MacArthur told General Richard Sutherland to show Shigemitsu where to sign. The hesitation ended. Shigemitsu signed. Umezu came next. He did not sit down. He leaned forward over the table standing and wrote his name. He did not look at MacArthur. He did not acknowledge the Allied representatives across the table. He signed, straightened, and returned to his position. His face never changed. And here is what MacArthur had understood that nobody else had fully articulated. It did not matter. None of it mattered. Not the composure, not the mask, not the ceremonial sword, not the refusal to bow, not the posture of men performing military dignity under maximum duress. None of it touched what was actually happening, because MacArthur had not built a ceremony that required the Japanese to perform submission. He had built a ceremony in which submission was structurally completed by the act of being there, by arriving, by standing on that side of the table, by placing a signature on a document that said in language that would be preserved for the entirety of recorded history, Japan surrendered. The war in the Pacific ended here. This is where it happened. These are the names of the men who signed it. You could stand straight. You could keep your face correct. You could refuse every visible gesture of humiliation. The architecture of the ceremony had already finished the sentence, without your permission. The signing took 23 minutes. When the last Allied representative put down his pen, MacArthur returned to the microphone. He called for peace. He said he hoped a better world would emerge. He extended a future in which Japan and its people had a place not from sentiment, but from strategy, because a defeated people with no future create the conditions for the next war. Then, as if timed by God or by MacArthur, which in the Pacific Theater were often the same thing, the sound reached the deck first. A low building thunder from the overcast sky. Then the planes appeared. Hundreds of them. B-29s and carrier aircraft in tight formation passing over Tokyo Bay in a display timed to the second. The sound washed across the harbor. It faded. The silence returned. Umezu had not bowed, but he had signed his name under an instrument of surrender in front of hundreds of witnesses on an American ship in Japanese waters, with the men his armies had imprisoned standing directly behind the general who had defeated him across 9,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. The bow was never the point. The bow was the smallest part of what had happened that morning. MacArthur had understood something that the Japanese military, for all its discipline and its centuries of warrior tradition, had not. You do not need a man to kneel if you have already built the room that makes him small. The ceremony ended. MacArthur folded his prepared remarks and stepped back from the microphone. He had 17 minutes of film footage, hundreds of photographs, 2 signed original documents, and the testimony of hundreds of witnesses to what had occurred on that deck. But here is what nobody watching that morning knew. What happened in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, was only the foundation. The real battle, the one that would determine whether this surrender held, whether it became permanent, whether Japan would rise again as an ally or smolder toward a second war, that battle had not yet begun. And it would require MacArthur to do something that shocked his own staff, alarmed Washington, and violated every instinct of a victorious military commander. He was going to walk into the Imperial Palace and make a decision that would either save Japan or destroy everything the surrender had built. On September 2, 1945, Douglas MacArthur stood on the deck of the USS Missouri and watched General Umezu sign his name to the end of the Japanese Empire. No bow, no visible submission. Just a signature on a green cloth table in a harbor Japan had once believed was untouchable. MacArthur had built the ceremony like an architect builds a load-bearing wall. Precise, deliberate, uncontestable. The defeat was made permanent before a single pen touched paper. But the ceremony was only the foundation. What MacArthur did in the 72 hours that followed would either hold that foundation in place or crack it down the middle. Here is a number that almost nobody knows. In September 1945, MacArthur had approximately 400,000 American troops to administer a nation of 80 million people across 4 main islands, a shattered economy, and a military culture that had spent 80 years telling its citizens that surrender was a form of death. That ratio, 1 soldier for every 200 civilians, was not an occupation force. It was a skeleton. And MacArthur knew that if the wrong decision was made in the first 72 hours, that skeleton would not hold. And here is when everything became significantly more complicated. The pressure was coming from Washington, and it was coming hard. Secretary of State James Burns had cabled MacArthur's headquarters within hours of the Missouri ceremony with a recommendation that had the backing of several senior officials in the Truman administration. Arrest Emperor Hirohito. Charge him before the Allied tribunal. Put him on trial alongside the generals who had planned and executed the war. The argument was straightforward. You cannot hold Nazi leaders accountable at Nuremberg while allowing the head of the Japanese state to sit untouched in his palace. The optics were untenable. The principle was indefensible. Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, MacArthur's military secretary and one of his closest advisors on Japanese affairs, walked into MacArthur's office in Yokohama on the evening of September 2nd with the cable in his hand. Fellers had spent years studying Japanese culture and psychology. He had written the psychological warfare assessments that shaped American propaganda operations across the Pacific. He understood what the emperor meant to ordinary Japanese people in a way that most American officers simply did not. MacArthur read the cable. He set it down. He looked at Fellers and said something that Fellers later recorded in his memoirs. If we arrest Hirohito, I will need 1 million men to hold this country together. Do we have 1 million men? Fellers said they did not. MacArthur said, then we are not arresting Hirohito. It was not a complicated calculation, but it was an extraordinarily dangerous one. MacArthur was about to directly contradict the recommendation of the Secretary of State override the instinct of the Truman administration and make a unilateral decision about the most politically sensitive figure in occupied Japan, based on his own strategic judgment and nothing else. If he was wrong, there was no recovery. If civil disorder broke out across Japan's 4 main islands, if the military factions that had opposed surrender reorganized around the emperor's continued presence, if the occupation collapsed into violence, MacArthur would own every death. He cabled Washington the following morning. The message was characteristically direct. Arresting the emperor would create a martyr. It would not serve justice. It would guarantee instability. The occupation required a stable administrative structure, and the emperor was the only figure in Japan capable of providing one. MacArthur recommended against the arrest and stated his intention to meet with Hirohito privately before any further decisions were made. Washington was not pleased, but MacArthur was the supreme commander, and he was already moving. The meeting was scheduled for September 27, 1945, at the American Embassy in Tokyo, 25 days after the Missouri ceremony. In the intervening weeks, MacArthur had moved his headquarters into the Daiichi Insurance Building, a 6-story Western structure that stood directly across the moat from the Imperial Palace grounds. Every Japanese citizen walking past the palace could see the Supreme Commander's building on the other side of the water. MacArthur had not chosen that location by accident. The geography of authority was written into the daily landscape of the city. On the morning of September 27th, Emperor Hirohito, dressed in formal morning clothes, black coat, striped trousers, top hat, and traveled to the American Embassy in a motorcade. He was the son of heaven. He was descended by Japanese imperial tradition from the goddess Amaterasu. He had never in his life traveled to meet another man. Other men traveled to meet him. The journey itself, before he set foot inside the building, was a statement that no ceremony on a battleship deck had made quite so directly. MacArthur received him in his open-collar khaki uniform. No jacket, no medals. He wore what he wore every day. He did not dress up for emperors. The meeting lasted 37 minutes. No transcript was made by MacArthur's specific instruction. What we know of the conversation comes from the accounts of the interpreters present. Hirohito spoke first. He stated that he came to offer himself to the judgment of the Allied powers. He said that responsibility for the war rested with him, and that whatever decision MacArthur and the Allied tribunal made regarding his person, he accepted it. MacArthur, by every account, was visibly moved. He had not expected this. He had expected a man performing submission. Instead, he received what appeared to be genuine acceptance of consequence. Whether it was genuine or strategic, MacArthur could not know for certain. What he knew was that this response offered in private, without an audience with no political advantage to be gained, was either the most honest statement a Japanese leader had made since the war began, or the most sophisticated political move available to a man with no remaining options. MacArthur extended his hand. After the meeting, a photographer was brought in. The photograph was taken in the entrance hall of the embassy. MacArthur, in his khakis, standing half a head taller than the emperor in his formal morning dress. The contrast was absolute. Not staged to humiliate, staged to record. That photograph ran in every Japanese newspaper the following morning. It ran on front pages across the Allied world. In a single image, without a word of caption, it communicated the new structure of authority in occupied Japan. The emperor remained, but the source of his legitimacy had changed. MacArthur immediately converted that reality into policy. Through a series of directives issued in the first weeks of October 1945, he dissolved the existing structure of imperial military authority, beginning with the formal abolition of the armed forces themselves. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy ceased to exist as legal institutions on October 15, 1945, 6 weeks after the Missouri ceremony. The men who had built their entire identity around those institutions, who had believed with complete sincerity that service to the emperor through military discipline was the highest expression of human purpose, those men were now civilians. MacArthur then did something that stunned even his own staff. He instructed his team to begin drafting a new Japanese constitution, not to impose American law wholesale, not to demand that Japan remake itself in the image of the United States, but to design a constitutional structure that would make the specific conditions that had produced the war, the unchecked military authority, the suppression of civilian government, the emperor worship that had functioned as a political weapon, structurally impossible in the future. The process took months. The document that emerged, adopted in 1947, contained one article that had no precedent in any national constitution in history. Article 9, Japan renounced war. Permanently. The Japanese state committed itself in its foundational law to never again maintaining offensive military capacity. The nation that had built the largest naval air force in history, that had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had occupied territory from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, now wrote into its constitution that it would never again wage war. Umezu was in Sugamo prison by December 1945. He would be convicted of war crimes in November 1948 and would die in that prison in January 1949, 4 years after standing at rigid attention on the deck of the Missouri, with his ceremonial sword at his hip and his face arranged into an expression of controlled refusal. He had refused to bow. He had maintained his composure through every second of the ceremony. He had given MacArthur nothing visible to point to as submission. None of it had made the smallest difference to what happened next. But here is what the occupation files declassified, decades later, revealed something that changes the entire story of what MacArthur built in Japan, and why it held, and why it almost didn't. Inside the Japanese military factions that had opposed the surrender, a plan had been in motion since August 16th, the day after the Emperor's broadcast. A plan that had nothing to do with ceremony or constitutions or photographs in embassy hallways, and it had a name. And when MacArthur's intelligence officers found out about it in late October 1945, every calculation the Supreme Commander had made about the occupation shifted overnight. The war on paper was over. The other war was just beginning. MacArthur had signed the documents. He had preserved the Emperor. He had dissolved the army and begun drafting a constitution that would make war structurally impossible for Japan to wage again. For 25 days, the occupation had proceeded with a precision that surprised even his own staff. Then in late October 1945, a folder landed on his desk inside the WWII building. Inside it was the name of a plan. And the plan had been running since August 16th, the day after the Emperor told Japan the war was over. The plan was called Keitsugo Zoku, continuation of decisive operation. And the number attached to it was not small. Intelligence estimates suggested that between 200,000 and 350,000 armed Japanese soldiers across the home islands had not yet formally surrendered their weapons or their allegiance. They had signed nothing. They had accepted nothing. They were waiting. And now MacArthur had to decide what to do about them before they decided what to do about him. The intelligence picture that assembled itself across October 1945 was not a picture of organized resistance. It was something more complicated and in some ways more dangerous. These were not rogue units preparing a conventional military assault on American positions. They were officers and enlisted men who had received the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15th and had experienced it as a form of cognitive collapse. Their entire identity, every belief about duty, honor, and the meaning of sacrifice had been organized around the proposition that Japan could not be defeated. The Emperor himself had just announced that it had been. The psychological shock was total. Some units had already disarmed voluntarily. Others had destroyed their own weapons rather than hand them over to American forces. But a significant number had done neither. They were holding position, holding weapons, and holding the question open. The specific intelligence that alarmed MacArthur's G2 section was not about weapons counts. It was about a network of communication that had continued operating after the surrender, connecting hardline military factionists across multiple prefectures with a simple shared message: the Emperor had been coerced. The surrender was not legitimate. The war was not over. MacArthur read the intelligence assessment and made a decision that contradicted every conventional instinct of military occupation. He did not order a sweep. He did not dispatch American units to force disarmament at gunpoint across the home islands. He calculated correctly that a visible American military crackdown on Japanese holdouts would produce exactly the martyrdom narrative the hardliners needed. Every soldier killed resisting disarmament would become a symbol. Every American rifle pointed at a Japanese veteran would confirm the argument that the occupation was conquest, not transition. Instead, he issued his order through the Emperor's own command structure. Hirohito, whose continued position rested entirely on MacArthur's decision to allow. It issued imperial directives to military commanders across Japan, ordering immediate and complete disarmament. The directives carried the full weight of imperial authority, the same authority these men had built their lives around obeying. MacArthur had kept the Emperor in place precisely for this moment. He converted the imperial chain of command into an instrument of occupation without firing a single additional shot. It worked, not instantly, not completely. But over the weeks that followed, unit after unit stood down. Weapons were surrendered. The network that Ketsugo-zoku had tried to maintain across the prefectures lost its organizational coherence as local commanders received imperial orders they could not refuse without repudiating the very framework that had given their lives meaning. By December 1945, the formal disarmament of the Japanese military was by any measurable standard complete. Over 7 million soldiers and sailors had been demobilized. More than 3 million additional Japanese troops stationed across Asia and the Pacific had been repatriated and disarmed. The largest military force Asia had ever produced ceased to exist as a functional institution in approximately 90 days. MacArthur had accomplished with paper chain of command and a preserved emperor what would have required, by his own estimate, 1 million additional troops and years of violent suppression to achieve by force. But the harder problem was not the soldiers with rifles. It was the society those soldiers were returning to. The document was adopted by the Imperial Diet in November 1946 and came into force on May 3, 1947. Japan had a constitution that had been drafted in 6 days by American lawyers and military officers in a building across the moat from the Imperial Palace. It would govern the country for the next 8 decades without a single amendment. Umezu was in Sugamo prison when the constitution came into force. Shigemitsu was still completing his legal proceedings. The men who had stood across the table from MacArthur on the Missouri were being processed through the machinery that MacArthur's occupation had built. The architecture of the surrender was converting itself institution by institution into the architecture of a different country. But there was one figure whose fate the occupation files never quite resolved. One man whose conduct in the years between the Missouri ceremony and the end of the occupation in 1952 remained a point of genuine historical debate. Not a general, not a cabinet minister. A man who had been in the room for decisions that shaped the entire trajectory of post-war Japan, and had left almost no personal record of what he believed about any of it. His name appears in the intelligence assessments. It appears in the Ketsugo-zoku files. It appears in a single photograph taken at a meeting inside the Daiichi building in November 1945 that has never been fully explained, and what he knew what he had done between August 15th and September 2nd, 1945. In the 17 days between the Emperor's broadcast and the Missouri ceremony may be the most important untold chapter of the entire story. 3 months after the Missouri ceremony, MacArthur had dissolved, an empire preserved, an emperor disarmed 7 million soldiers, prevented a famine, and drafted a constitution in 6 days. He had done all of it with 400,000 troops and a cleared desk. The man in the photograph in the Daiichi building, the one whose name appeared in the Ketsugo-zoku intelligence files, was still unidentified. But before we go there is a question that the entire 4-part story of the Missouri and the occupation has been circling without answering directly. What happened to the men who made this moment? What happened to MacArthur himself? And what does any of it mean? 7 decades later, in a world that the Missouri ceremony helped to build, MacArthur ran the occupation of Japan until April 1951, nearly 6 years after the surrender. He was relieved of command by President Truman during the Korean War, fired in the bluntest terms for publicly contradicting the commander-in-chief's policy on whether to expand the war into China. He returned to the United States, to a ticker tape parade in New York, and an address to a joint session of Congress that produced one of the most quoted lines in American military history. He said, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Then he largely did exactly that. He lived quietly in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York until his death in April 1964. He was 84 years old. He never returned to Japan. He never saw what the country became. Or rather, he saw the beginning of it, the first years of economic recovery, the early operation of the new democratic institutions, the establishment of the self-defense forces that replaced the abolished military. But he did not live to see the full arc of what the occupation had produced. By the time of his death, Japan was 11 years into what economic historians would later call the Japanese economic miracle, a period of growth so rapid and sustained that it transformed a bombed-out, famine-threatened nation into the world's second-largest economy within a single generation. MacArthur had not caused that. The Japanese people had caused that through their own labor ingenuity and institutional capacity. But the occupation had created the conditions. The land reform that redistributed agricultural land from landlords to farmers. the dissolution of the Zaibatsu industrial combines that had controlled the pre-war economy, the constitution that provided stable democratic governance, and the security guarantee that allowed Japan to redirect military spending into industrial investment. These were MacArthur's decisions, made in the Daiichi building across the moat from the Imperial Palace in the years between 1945 and 1951. Their consequences compounded across the decades that followed in ways he could not have fully calculated. The men who had stood across the table from him on the Missouri followed different trajectories. Umezu died in Sugamo prison in January 1949, convicted, sentenced, and gone before the first wave of sentence reductions reached the surviving war criminals. Shigemitsu was released in 1950, returned to political life and served as foreign minister again in 1954. The civilian diplomat who had hesitated over the documents on the green cloth table, signing under an instrument of surrender, later signing treaties as a representative of the recovered nation. General Jonathan Wainwright, who had stood behind MacArthur as the emaciated evidence of what the war had cost, was awarded the Medal of Honor, promoted to full general, and retired in 1947. He died in 1953. He had outlasted the men who had imprisoned him. But here is the detail that closes the circle in a way that no official history quite captures. The man in the photograph. The figure whose name appeared in the Ketsugo Zoku files and in a single image taken inside the Daiichi building in November 1945, identified in declassified SCAP records, released in the 1990s as a mid-level liaison officer named Takashi Morioka, had spent the 17 days between the Emperor's broadcast on August 15th and the Missouri ceremony on September 2nd, doing something that nobody in MacArthur's intelligence structure had detected in real time. He had been carrying messages between the hardline military faction that was trying to keep Ketsugo Zoku alive and the imperial household officials who were trying to ensure the surrender proceeded without incident. He was depending on how you read the evidence, either a double agent working to undermine the resistance network on behalf of the palace, or a genuine hardliner who lost his nerve at the final moment. The SCAP files do not resolve this question. They only establish that he was present in both places, that he knew about the network, and that the network collapsed faster than MacArthur's G2 section had projected faster. Some analysts have suggested that it would have collapsed on its own. Morioka was never charged. He was never publicly identified during the occupation. He appears in no memoir, no published account, no history written before the 1990s. He lived in Osaka, of entrenchment, or build the environment in which the beliefs become structurally unsustainable and allow the change to happen on its own logic. MacArthur chose the second path consistently, and the results speak across 79 years. Japan has not fought a war since September 2, 1945. Not a single one. The nation that built the Yamato, the largest battleship in history, that launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, that occupied territory from Manchuria to New Guinea, has maintained an unbroken peace for 8 decades, under a constitution drafted in 6 days by American lawyers in a building across from the Imperial Palace. Whatever one thinks of the method, the outcome is without historical parallel. Here is the number that closes the story. Historians estimate that Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, cancelled when Japan surrendered, would have killed between 250,000 and 1 million American soldiers, and between 5 and 10 million Japanese civilians and military personnel, based on the casualty projections prepared by MacArthur's own staff in the summer of 1945. The occupation that replaced invasion cost a fraction of that in every measurable category: lives money time, and the generational damage that extended warfare produces in the societies that survive it. MacArthur did not win the Pacific War. The soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who fought across 9,000 miles of ocean and jungle and volcanic island did that. But the man who stood at the microphone on the deck of the Missouri and then crossed the moat into the capital of a defeated empire and spent 6 years converting surrender into peace, that man built something that the fighting alone could never have produced. Umezu had refused to bow. He had maintained his composure and his bearing and his ceremonial sword and every visible marker of military dignity available to him on that deck. He died 4 years later in a prison cell, convicted by a tribunal, until 1978. Worked as an accountant, and left behind a single handwritten document that his family donated to a prefectural archive in 2003. The document is a personal account of the 17 days between the broadcast and the ceremony. It describes in the flat language of a man recording facts rather than performing emotions, what it felt like to know that the surrender was going to happen, to know that some of his colleagues intended to prevent it, and to make a decision about which side of that choice he was going to stand on. He wrote, "I did not know if I was loyal or a traitor. I only knew that more men dying would not change what had already been decided by heaven." The document runs to 41 pages. It has never been translated into English. The lesson that the Missouri ceremony and the occupation that followed it carries across 8 decades is not primarily about military strategy, though the strategic achievement was extraordinary. It is not primarily about constitutional design, though the constitutional achievement was durable beyond any reasonable expectation. It is about the relationship between authority and architecture, the principle that the most complete forms of power are those that do not require visible force to operate. MacArthur never raised his voice on the deck of the Missouri. He never threatened the Japanese delegation. He built a situation in which the physical reality of the defeat was so structurally complete that no behavioral response available to the Japanese officers could meaningfully contest it. And then he extended that same principle across 6 years of occupation, institution by institution, directive by directive, converting a military surrender into a social transformation without triggering the resistance that open suppression would have generated. This is a lesson that applies well beyond the specific circumstances of post-war Japan. Every institution that has ever faced the problem of changing deeply held beliefs in a resistant population has encountered the same fundamental choice: confront the beliefs directly and generate defense operating under a constitution drafted in the building across from the palace of the emperor, whose authority he had spent his career serving. MacArthur had not needed the bow. He had already built the room. And in the end, that is the only lesson that matters. The most durable victories are never the ones you take by force. They are the ones you build so completely, so structurally, so permanently into the world around the defeated party that the only thing left for anyone to argue about is how they stood while it happened. If you know another story like this one, a moment where architecture defeated force, where design outlasted power, leave it in the comments. These are the stories that history buries and that deserve to be found. Subscribe if you want to keep finding them, because the ones that matter most are almost never the ones that made the front page. The war ended on September 2nd, 1945 in 23 minutes, on a green cloth table in a harbor Japan once believed was untouchable. Everything that came after was MacArthur finishing the sentence that the Missouri had begun.